somehow or other influenced by uh, municipal or industrial use or even ag use, and does the energy that would come out of that kind of facility have the kind of flexibility we're interested in?
Thank you, gentlemen. Let's take a break until 5 till, and then we will take our public comments. I only have one card, so if any of you have pent up things you would like to say, if you'd see the gentleman at the front of the room here, fill out a blue card. With that, we'll see you in 10 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, could we get going here, please? Russ, do you want to lead the charge this time and sit down first? Russ, be a leader. Attaboy. He didn't hear me. Peter, that goes for you and Mr. Gwinnett, too. Mr. O'Loughlin was a good boy. He sat down right away. He's learning. I only have 2 cards. Is that all the public comment we want to hear today? Anyhow, you got a chance. John Shelton. Let me guess what you're going to say.
There's actually 2 of us that present. Dean Marston's going to come up too. Again, my name is John Shelton. I represent the California Department of Fish and Game. And I've said this before, but just to make sure you guys always realize, I'm a staff environmental scientist. I'm a systems ecologist. I'm not necessarily a salmon biologist, but I do work with salmon issues and stuff. And then Dean's going to come up and present. Dean, of course, presented yesterday, and he is my boss. He's environmental program manager, and even though he's our lead on salmon modeling, he has lots of other things he's supposed to do too, like approve my timesheets and things like that. So I did want to thank you very much for this opportunity, not just the opportunity to talk during the public comments, but the whole workshop series. I think the agencies, we do coordinate quite a bit together, and I think we find this very, very useful. So I thank you for this and the opportunity to come back during the public comments. Of course, the reason for this, as you kind of said, is pretty obvious from earlier discussions today. But there isn't a more important reason. We are a public trust agency. You guys are a public trust agency. And as such, we're tasked to come up with the best available science. And I know from talking to your staff under numerous occasions, and I know from listening to you guys, that you take this charge very, very seriously. And my push here is that Department of Fish and Game, we also take it very, very seriously to come up with the best available science, which does mean there are things every now and then we don't have enough science on, and we'll state that many times. There are things we don't know very well, but I think this has been said in front of the board in the past. I know it's been said from some of the invited panels during the first phase. This delta is one of the best studied deltas in estuaries in the world. We do have good science. We don't have everything we need, but we have some pretty good science. So going from that, I did want to make sure you understand there are things that we look at that sometimes get bled a little bit one way or bled a little bit another way. So as an example of some of the best available science, Dr. Lindley and his group from National Marine Fisheries put out a report on the ocean conditions and the collapse of the Central Valley salmonids in 2005, 2006. If you read through the report, it's not just a report that's saying ocean conditions were bad and we had a collapse. He does come through and he states very, very specifically that one of the things that have gone on is, if I get my better notes out to make sure I say it right, that if you have increased genetic diversity, you get increased phenetic diversity. The types of salmon, the individuals are increased. And if you have increased phenetic diversity, you increase the resilience in the ocean to less conditions. So the point of this is that we do have the opportunity to send our salmon to the ocean in a way that they're much better able to get there. What that is then based on is the natural flow regime and a greater variation of flow regime. So an increased flow regime leads to an increased genetic variation in the salmon stocks. And the increased genetic variation leads to the increased phenetic variation, which increases the resilience. So that if you have a bad year in the oceans, you have the ability to withstand a bad year or a bad 2 years much better than if you have very monotypic, monogenetic sort of systems. So, and then we also have a lot of comments pretty much specific to the CalSim model and stuff, and Dean was going to go ahead and go through quite a few of those, and I'll come at the end and help answer any other questions.
John, on your last comment, I mean, please help me here, and I'm not being critical of it, but basically what you're saying, I believe, is if we have this increased genetic diversity, we have subsets of runs, if you will. You're throwing more fish at the system over a broader period of time. On one hand, we talk about all these natural paradigms and mimicking something that happened historically, and I think we all know that whether it's good or bad, we have this godlike role of trying to preserve the species by manipulating natural phenomena. And I'm not saying that is wrong. Maybe that's the only way to do it. But there again, it strikes me that we're not doing this in a coordinated fashion, that we don't have a stated policy from yourselves and Mr. Gwinnett and others that say, you know, we feel that in this situation, the only way we're going to begin reaching our goals of salmon doubling is to manipulate runs and have sub-runs within, you know, almost, if I'm hearing you correctly, they're saying we almost need to have this constant barrage of fish coming in and going out to enhance our chances in the ocean and avoid some of the natural jeopardies that have occurred historically by having just a couple of runs. Is that, am I putting words in your mouth, or is that what you're saying?
Yeah, you're close to some of the ideas. There is more to this, and actually I had some with some of the concluding remarks that can cover our salmon goals, and I can touch upon those. But there is the issue, it's not necessarily multiple sub-runs. It's a difference. We hear it with our kids all these days. We grew up more in the old analog age. You know, we had our LPs that we listened to that were analog. They, you know, now we have digital, right? Natural processes are analog. So when you have flow variation, it's not plus or minus. There's gradations between it. And so the genetic variation you have, it doesn't necessarily mean that in 1 year you'll have 2 subpopulations or 3 subpopulations. 1 year you may have 10, the next year you may have 2, depending on how those spikes of pushing the salmon on out. Some salmon are very, very flexible if you have a natural system to work with, and they figure out different ways to work with that system. What we have done with our manipulation with society is we've made it much more uniform. So we give them one pulse flow to go through. So they have a 2-week period. Go on down now or forever hold your peace. Well, if the adults that came up were a little late, so the eggs weren't quite hatched yet, those are adults that are out of the population. If they were a little early and they were already sitting around, well, they may have already gotten gobbled up, or they may have already decided to do another lifestyle through that system.
But we may not have the luxury of having enough water to throw at the system to accommodate all these potential variabilities. Maybe Betty Lou and Bobby stayed at the show and ate popcorn when everybody else headed for the back seat of the car. I don't know. But, you know, there's always going to be losers in the system, and I don't know that, you know, and I'm not here to debate you on this, but I don't know that we're going to have the luxury of optimizing the system 365 days a year in case somebody's progeny just happened to be a little bit off cycle. I'm having a hard time figuring out how we're going to do it with the identities we already know.
So several of the modeling folks would come up and tell you that really a lot of the ways you've learned through the process as you work through these things. I think most of the fish agencies will support me on this and say, we're not looking for all the water because we don't think that's something that you can do. We also know the system's changed. So even if you had the old unimpaired or natural flow regime, there's still things that we know we need to do to the system. So we're not asking for all of it, but we do know we can make some increases in our populations. One of the other issues, and I know the San Joaquin much better than I know the Sacramento system, but you saw some graphs of population fluctuations that were sent up by some, and you saw these huge variations in numbers. We've had that on the San Joaquin probably before we even really started doing things. We know, as far as our records go, that we've had some pretty good fluctuations in numbers. But what that means for resilience is when you get a good year, we really need to pop up the population numbers on those. But we also need to be able to keep the populations relatively strong in the not so good years because we know we're not going to have the great years. So we have the ability, we have flexibility to come up and say, we don't need all your water. You know, maybe if you gave us all your water, yeah, we might be able to do really good things with it, but we know that's not going to happen. We think we can do a lot more with what we have. But we do have a system, especially on the San Joaquin side, where we have very little water for this. And we have water that comes at the wrong time. So we have these big flows that happen at times of years where it's like none of the fish are ready to take advantage of it. And I think we'll all say is you know, fishery folks is, we're not going to design a perfect system. But the natural system wasn't perfect. And there are some ways to work with it so that we can regain some of that resilience that actually makes these things better for us. So and then
To be continued, huh?
Hi again, my name is Dean Marston, Fisheries Program Manager for the Department of Fish and Game, and I would like to, is this low enough?
If you're watching John's time clock, he's just sitting there right now, not doing anything, so you might want to clock him out while you talk. I don't know.
Okay. I have a few comments that I'd like to make in regards to some of the information that was presented this morning. Let me just say to start that SALSEM, AAK version 2.0, are synonymous, right? They're the exact same model development process. SALSEM 2.0, 2.0 SALSEM. So SALSEM has been a collaborative process between the department and highly respected researchers in academia, private consulting, and federal fish agencies, such as Dr. Alan Hubbard, statistician at UC Berkeley, Dr. Wayne Getz, an ecologist and mathematician also at UC Berkeley, Dr. Brian Wells, an oceanographer at NOAA, Dr. Carl Miesick, who is a fisheries biologist, both for Fish and Wildlife Service and as a private consultant, Dr. Henrietta Yeager is a modeler with Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and also Mr. Aubrey Dotan, who has extensive experience in hydrology and water temperature modeling. You will note the absence of individuals from the Salmon River Tributaries Association. And so why is this? Well, in 2008, we walked across the aisle and we asked them to participate in model development, and they turned us down. They have knowledge that we were developing SALSEM by virtue of the repeated comments we've made to the board, either verbally or in writings and submittals to the board. And they have not come across the aisle and offered to us, hey, can we come and join you in your model development process? In addition to that, when we do meet with Salmon River Tributary interest, I have to say on a technical basis, from my own personal experience, it's typically dominated by lawyers. It is what it is. For my next point, regarding the assertion that DFG does not make its information available, we send out weekly updates for our two primary field sampling efforts. For instance, this fall we're conducting salmon counts in each of the Salmon River tributaries, and we send out that information on a weekly basis through a wide email alert that has an Excel spreadsheet in it, and entities that represent the Salmon River water suppliers are included as individuals. They receive that information, so we send it out. And we also send it out for our spring juvenile sampling that's conducted each year, as well as the number of fish that are spawned at our Merced River Hatchery. And we also make available our extensive database library of water temperature data that we've collected for over a decade throughout the Salmon River Basin. So we do make our information publicly available. For my next point, regarding reliability of adult salmon counts, the department submitted to you, the board, in 2010, 2011, it escapes me which year it was, we submitted a report comparing both weir counts and Stanislaus River spawn and survey counts. And the conclusion that was that though there does exist within year differences between the two counting methods, that across years there is no statistically significant difference between these two counting methods. So what does that mean? That means they're both equally either reliable or unreliable. They're just both equal. There is no difference between the two. That means that they both can be used for management planning purposes.
Dean, how do you account for the 40% to 50% variance? I mean, I guess it would be counterintuitive to, if the cameras were reasonably functional, and I think Mr. O'Loughlin acknowledged that there was times when they were down and there were some issues, but generally speaking, they were on call 24/7. it would seem that the best efforts of the hackers counting carcasses would have some limitations that exceeded those of the camera, if you will, because of weather, of holidays, of people being sick or whatever. You would assume that, I would think, and don't be bashful about correcting me if I'm wrong, you would assume that the numbers that were actually counted when they hacked the carcasses would have to have some factor put on them that plussed that number. I mean, you certainly assume there wouldn't be less, but potentially more because of a coyote dragging a carcass off to the weeds or an eagle flying off with one or something. So I would think that, you know, whether the number is 40 or 50%, there'd have to be some factor that would have relativity. But tell me if I'm wrong, and I'm not going to throw my water bottle at you because it's almost empty and I couldn't reach it. So.
Appreciate, thank you. I appreciate you asking the question. Neither method, counting method, is imperfect. Actually, both methods need to have some expansion factor applied to them. I'm not going to stand up here and say that we count every single salmon that goes upstream to spawn. We don't. But the weir doesn't count every salmon that goes either by or over the weir or around the weir either. Fish could go under the weir, fish can go over the weir, fish can go upstream and then come back down and then go back up again. And there's times when the weir can't even be put in because of flow conditions. So my point
is to say then that either method undercounts to one degree or another the actual numbers to go up.
I think that's probably a fair assessment, but I don't know to what degree. For my next point, let's talk a moment about carrying capacity, otherwise known in ecology as density-dependent mortality. The issue really is that the number of fall spawners that's controlling future generations of adult spawners, because we have too many. We talked about spawning superimposition this morning, or excuse me, the Tributaries Association did and I did yesterday, or is it spring flow, by way of example? And again, in 2008, in a record that you have in your archives, the department submitted to you as part of our response to peer review number 1, a report that was prepared by Dr. Alan Hubbard, who's our lead statistician in model development. And he concluded, excuse me, that 2 statistical models could be fit to the adult spawner abundance trend to explain why we reach a certain number of spawners and then drops. And both models could be fit to the data. Number of fall spawners could cause the crash, and also the amount of spring flow could cause the crash. However, he concluded, looking at the variance within the data set, that spring flow did a far better job of explaining the variability in the data set, the number of fall spawners. So what does this mean? This means that as the number of juveniles increases with flow, excuse me, that the number of juveniles increases as flow increases, and that as the number of juveniles increase, the number of adults also increases. That the population is controlled by, as the hydrology in the system returns back to low flow conditions because we're killing juveniles and preventing the population from continuing to decline. That's effectively what it means in ecological speak. My next point, using available information in model development. The assertion is made that the department is not using water supply or data. Need to give a little bit of background here. To begin, the department is the legally recognized entity that has trustee responsibility for all of California's fish and wildlife resources, including salmon. We have the legal authority to regulate how, where, and when people collect information to reduce impacts to our resources. We regulate information, or that information collection, excuse me, via our scientific collecting permit process. The Salmon River water supplier consultants are required by law to obtain these permits and submit their information to the department so we can use this information to better manage the state's resources. We have access, in short, to the data that the consultants collect, and they've provided to the department. And principally, these include salmon counts at weirs and juvenile catch data at various trapping locations. And in addition, as additional information was needed from consultants, some of which work for Mr. Demko that appeared before the board this morning, when we've asked, his staff has provided information to the department. As we move forward with model development after its release, we welcome all new information. You know, we'll take it. and we'll utilize it, and we'll ask other people to help us what they think about the data they just provided. I mean, it's not intended to be an exclusive process. My next point, I have to speak momentarily to some inconsistency, and I need to point out some inconsistency in statements by the Tributary Association this morning. On one hand, they allege that predators are a major problem for salmon in the Salmon River Basin. Yet on the other hand, they stated that no data has been collected, so how can Fish and Game have predation influence in its model? I don't know if you see the contradiction there. If there's no data, how can they then conclude that predation is a major problem? Moving to my next point. There is naturally produced fish in Salmon River tributaries. We have the ability to tease out abundance of hatchery and naturally produced salmon in these tributaries. Yes, percentages of hatchery-produced fish in recent years is high, but it's not 100%. And I have to go back to, was it Paul Harvey a little bit in the rest of the story? We have, on one hand, we have hatchery fish to mitigate water development impacts that have occurred through decades. We also then have mitigation hatcheries and release hatchery fish in the delta and bay to overcome poor survival in the tributaries that is due in part to insufficient flow. We also know that adults stray in large part due to where they were released as juveniles. And now we have water suppliers coming back to us and saying that we've got too many hatchery fish that we're having to produce in the first place because we have all this water development. So I just want to remind the board that we conducted this greatest society experiment in the Salmon River Basin. And we exturbated and traded Salmon River salmon production in favor of fall-run salmon production and reduced their habitat by 50%, hoping that we can compensate for all those impacts that we occurred. And heretofore, that great societal experiment has been an abysmal failure. So to cut to the chase on this one, we need to increase natural production in order to reduce the level of hatchery production. We won't know what natural production we're going to get until we start increasing flow to see what natural production we can actually achieve. That will tell us the feedback mechanism, how much reduction in hatchery fish we can do over time. For my next point, getting close to the end. Thank you for your patience. There was an assertion that DFG's model is based on a relationship between flow and escapement 2.5 years later. Let me emphatically say that this is not the case, and this is an old data set. This data set has lots of variability in it because it assigns all sorts of factors that can potentially influence adult salmon production and assigns all of that variance in the data and ascribes it principally to flow. So by default, it's going to have a lot of variance in it, a lot of variability. And these other factors, ocean conditions, exports, harvest, et cetera. And again, doing this adds a lot of variability. We knew it going in years ago, but we needed additional information to tease out the variability attributable to these other various factors. The ability to do this has emerged, and that information continues to come forth. Today, we use spring flow versus brood year production. Different metric, take me a little while maybe to walk you through it, but it's a totally different metric, and it's much more reliable than the flow and escapement 2.5 years later. But be that as it may, the model version 1.6 and 2.0 and even 1.0, we didn't use either of these relationships. We used the number of juveniles entering the delta, and then estimated survival of juveniles through the delta, and then estimated the number of adults returning to spawn from the ocean based upon the number of juvenile salmon leaving the delta. So contrary to what you heard this morning, we do not use linear regressions. We use well-established nonlinear regressions. And the department has read the Tributaries Authority report along with its criticisms, and we will provide a thorough rebuttal to their assertions after the workshop. Finally, last point, thank you. Model version 1.6 is reliable for juvenile abundance. Yesterday, I did not say, let me repeat that, I did not say that DFG's model version 1.6 was unreliable. Those words did not come out of this mouth. Rather, I showed that adult production estimates were off. And I also stated to you, the board, why I thought this was the case, what improvement was needed in the calculation in order to make the relationship better, and that was adding ocean conditions, and I said that we did that in model version 2.0. I also said that that did not render 1.6 useless as a management planning tool. I continued to show that juvenile abundance estimates were valid and I demonstrated why I came to this conclusion as a researcher. So in closing, in model version 2.0 and previous model versions, we're using statistically reliable and proven nonlinear relationships in model versions 1.6 and 2.0. 1.0 did have linear, so I'm talking from 1.5 on to 2.0. And this is all going to become apparent when SWRCB is released, and all comers, I'm sure, will give us their thoughts on that process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean.
So I'll be real quick in summary. I just wanted to add one more thing to this that we've been talking about. As you guys are very much aware of, and I think your staff are probably even more aware, we have several folks that tell us what we need to be doing. So this kind of goes to the concept of our goals and objectives for salmonids and others. So the department has several species-specific goals that are given to us, both by legislation, by the Fish and Game Commission, and by other actual laws that are produced. And we do some plans and other coordinated, and sometimes, in most instances in the last 20 years, we've done them in ways that we collaborate with multiple stakeholders. So as an example of those, I want to lead off with, of course, the Fish and Game Code, which is law to us. So the staff, we don't get to come out and say, no, we're not going to do this. So we get things handed to us. And of course, you're familiar with the Endangered Species Act, but we also have Section 6900, which is Salmon, Steelhead, Trout, and Anonymous Fisheries Program Act. We have another section, 7660, is Salmon Management. Again, tells us what our goals and objectives should be. And then we have another section, 7860, which is Commercial Trawlers Enhancement and Restoration Program. So we have multiple things that we're trying to balance on this stuff. And it goes back to the same ideas you guys have to face, is we balance on stuff. But we also have things that are coming down from our Fish and Game Commission, which you know, does, again, it's one more tie to the voters and to our stakeholders. And they have a Fish and Game Commission Policy Act on anonymous rainbow trout, steelhead. And then they have Fish and Game Commission policy on salmon. So we get those that are also handed down. But beyond that, there's also one where we work together with the Fish and Game Commission and the Board of Forestry on a Pacific salmon and anonymous trout on their program that we work together. And then we have several regular programs that we're working on these things. And I won't list them all, but some of the big ones that you probably have heard a little bit about. The Ecosystem Restoration Program, Conservation Strategy, that has come up in front of the board before. Of course, the San Joaquin River Chinook Salmon Restoration Program on the main stem. We have tremendous amount of paperwork and reports that come on that. The Klamath Trinity Salmon Fisheries Program comes up with goals and procedures. We also have the California Hatchery Review Report, and it is a look using a stakeholder approach, but also a best science process to look at our hatchery program and how we want to modify that. So that's out, and we're implementing that now. And then there are several things where we work together with other agencies. So we are co-managing with National Marine Fisheries Agency their recovery plans for the different salmonid stocks. And so we work hand in hand with them, along with the other agencies too. So we have lots of things out there. We do have the doubling goal. That is both a law and we have it incorporated in our policy. But there are several other things that we also look at, and it's a matter of balancing to see how we get to it. So.
Thank you, John. Deirdre?
My name is Deirdre Desjardins with California Water Research. The original title of this workshop was Water Supply, Climate Change, and Modeling, and somehow the water supply got dropped. But having looked at early permit decisions of the board, I think it's actually really critical to keep in mind when looking at these issues. I dug up the original 1956 water supply analysis by the Department of Water Resources and the Bureau of Reclamation that was submitted to the board for Decision 990 in 1960. That analysis and a 1966 water supply analysis for Decision 1275 are the only water supply analysis that have been done for the Delta. The 1956 analysis showed, very interestingly, it only looked at the bureau diversions, and it found that there was a deficit of 300,000 acre-feet a year on average in the summer. The water was supposed to be acquired somehow, and it never was. This did not address the Department of Water Resources permits, which have more serious issues. It turns out that the Department of Water Resources knew in 1960, when they issued contacts for 4 million acre-feet of water per year, that they only had the supply for about half of those permits. I want to read to you a brief quote from Bill Warren, the second Department of Water Resources director. This is in an oral interview around 1979. Malka Shaw was interviewing Bill Warren and said, "May I just interrupt you a minute? I want to see if I can understand this completely. In 1980, was it, when the initial California water plan is supposed to have been completed out of the Burns Border Plan?" Warren, not completed. That was the year the water was all going to be used. Chaw, all going to be used. And is that amount of water only 2 million some acre feet, or was it supposed to be 4? Warren, no, that amount of water was 4,230,000 acre feet. Chaw, and that was supposed to come from? Warren, about half of it would have to be through augmentation. Chaw, from the Feather River? From the Oroville and its conduits? Warren, no, the Oroville Reservoir didn't produce anywhere near that much. The Oroville Reservoir and the unallotted waters in the Sacramento Basin only provided about half of the 4 million. We always intended, the law itself says, that you're to build additional facilities. The law requires the offset of certain bonds in order to have money to build the additional facilities. Chaw, yes, I understood that, but I always thought that was in addition to the 4 million. Warren, no, oh no, oh no. Not in addition to the 4 million, in addition to the yield of the initial facilities, which provide about half the total amount. I was able, there were just, Department of Fish and Game has just been raked over the coals for not publicly releasing their data. I have found no information from Department of Water Resources anywhere about the yield of Oroville Reservoir or about the dependable yield of its facilities. I dug back through old bulletins, and the only estimate I found was in 1981 bulletin, which estimated that there was a dependable yield of about 2.3 million acre feet per year, and that it was likely to go down to 1.6 to 1.8 million acre feet per year by 2000 as a result of the maturity of water rights in the areas of origin. The board has the ability to require a new water supply analysis, and I would argue that it's essential to do that. Part of the reason is that the issues with the upstream reservoirs are related to this. There's been a lot of testimony that we can't provide meet X2 requirements without exhausting upstream reservoirs. But there was a peer-funded study in 2009 by a man named Aristogiakos. He simulated many of the major river basins around the world. He was paid by peer to build a simulation. He modeled every catchment, every dam, every stream, every tributary, and modeled it both under current hydrologic conditions and under the A2 future scenario. He found that under that scenario, if you used a stochastic look-ahead method of 9 months and predicted how much water you were going to have flowing into the system, whether it was going to be dry or wet, and you minimized risk instead of maximizing exports, that you could meet both X2 and deliver a safe and reliable water supply. But this was based on delivery of 4.9 million acre feet per year, which is substantially less than we're talking about with BDCP. The Bay Delta Conservation Plan modeling showed huge problems in the initial modeling. There were 120 months of dead pool storage. I would argue that it's not just related to climate change, but it's trying to meet aggressive export targets. I ran across comments in Department of Water Resources' own modeling in the 2006 comments. They stated, it appears that with climate change, we're taking more and more risks with carrier overstorage to meet export targets. And that's really an unacceptable risk, not just to the ecosystem, but to the water supply for 25 million people. We need to base our water engineering, our water supply system on actual hydrology, not on systems that were never built. And I would argue that the public trust charge of the board is to ensure that things are based on sound hydrology. Another issue with the Bay Delta Conservation Plan modeling is that it uses assumptions which partition the space of models, which essentially assume that wetter and drier futures are equally likely and weight both of those futures equally in producing model predictions for future stream flows. Not surprisingly, over the near term, they find that there's essentially no change, but that's only because they're averaging out wetter and drier futures by definition in their model. What we've seen with the recent 1,000-year drought in the Southwest, with the recent drought across the country, and droughts around the world in China and the Amazon basin and Portugal this past year, is that there's a lot of indications that we're going to see increasing droughts. And the models that predict the increasing droughts that we've seen are the higher greenhouse gas emission scenario models and the ones that are more sensitive to temperature. And all of those models pretty much uniformly predict a much drier California. They predict a significant reduction in stream flow in the Sierras, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, but also in the northern Sierras that are tributary. The other thing that Bay Delta Conservation Plan modeling does is map back onto the historic hydrology and use perturbations. The only model that doesn't do that is the WEEP model by David Perkey. And that model just implicitly produces stream flows that are directly input into calcium. WEEP and another model that doesn't map directly onto the historic hydrology both show a huge increase in dry and critically dry years, up to 40% by mid-century. The models are showing, this is in 2 studies published by the California Energy Center as part of the California Climate Adaptation Strategy, one in 2009 and one more recently in 2012. Both, it's essential, and I've submitted comments to Department of Water Resources and to the board that we use conservative assumptions about climate change for water supply for 25 million people. We need to really look at that, and we need to look at how can we also have species survive in a multi-year drought. So those are the arguments that I'm making. And I ask the board to please dig up the 1956 and 1966 water supply analyses from the dusty file cabinet in the basement where they are. digitize them and put them on the web. Because I had to look very hard to find the 1956 one, and the 1966 one isn't available anywhere. And as I said again, those should be updated, and we need to keep those in mind when we're looking at these issues.
Thank you, Deidre. Comments from my colleagues? Next steps? What did you hear? What do you want to do?
Well, I am, I'm going to have to think long and hard about this, and I assume we'll be talking with staff about follow-up, but I appreciate the your presentation. Just I assume, Tom, you do have 1966, so I think we can get that on the web, and I think so too. So I think we have found it if you're interested. I'm particularly interested in the various approaches to trying to figure out how to move forward. Among the things that were mentioned were WEEP, the structural decision-making, data ecological field tools, the logic chain, DRERIP, SMART. I think, we can't do all of those. We've got to sort of narrow down to some group of those or set of those. But I do think that we're going to need something structured like these different approaches that give the various constituents in an area, in a region, a way in which they can start to actually try to solve some problems. We hear why these things can't happen. We don't hear enough about how they could happen. And that's what the modeling was all about. But models come, like as I heard it, third. At the beginning, you've got to be clear about what it is you're trying to do, and then you've got to lay out what it might take to get there and make it measurable, and then look at models to see how you can test those hypotheses. So I really will be looking forward to talking to Tom and Karen and others about how we use some of these tools to incorporate the modeling and other data that was presented both this time and in the past.
Alicia?
Well, thank you, Fran. I'll look forward to the digesting of all of this over time. There was a lot of really interesting comments, a lot of heartfelt ones, a lot of, I think, chaff in the mix over a couple days. I was a little disappointed in that, I will just say. I know one person's reality is another person's chaff, but in this case, I actually was impressed with the folks who came and tried to help us think about the complexity of what it is we have to do, knowing we can't do all of it. But I agree, we're going to have to make some choices about what's realistic. I mean, we're not creating a plan for the ages here. We're updating the plans in the most realistic way we can for this next iteration. And so sorting through all of these suggestions, I think is going to be important. And I think there was a lot of value in the past 2 days. I just will look forward to how Brock, staff, and everyone tries to digest what we can take away from it and what we can use, what's relevant to this process and what's